We have been asked about doing this 100 times. Why don't you just put the MR20 internals into the Juke and make it a 2-liter? So, we decided to look into a stroker kit for the MR16 DDT. Now, keep in mind there is a MR18 DDT available to Renaults only that does make a lot more power, but those parts are extremely hard to find, and at the end of the day, you will still have OEM internals if you went that route. We can tell you the following. The MR18 DDT uses the same crank dimensions as the MR20 DD here in the States. How do we know this? The stroke on both the MR20 DD and the MR18 DDT is 90.1 millimeter, whereas the stroke of the MR16 DDT and MR18 DE is 81.1 millimeters. How is it that the MR20 DD has 0.21 more displacement? Easy. Different sleeves, bigger bore. The MR18DE also does this. The MR18DE and MR20DD both have 84mm bore, whereas the MR16DDT and MR18DDT have a 79.7mm bore. We measured to see if it would be possible to bore out an MR16 block to fit that larger of a piston. It is not possible to do that and make power. Ignoring the fact that we would need custom head gaskets, etc., it would make the cylinder walls extremely thin. 5.933 millimeters, or 2.335 inches. This tells us that the MR18DE and MR20DD use the same block with different sleeves. Based off the measurements taken from a head gasket, the cylinder walls on those blocks are 0.287 inches thick, quite a bit thinner than the MR16DDT's wall that is 0.315 inches thick. But those engines are not built for boost, so that thickness is fine. Could you use an MR18 or MR20 block instead of the MR16DDT block? It would bolt up minus a few critical features, oil squirters, turbo oil drain, and turbo oil feed locations being the main ones. So with all that out of the way, the end goal is a bolt-in stroker kit to increase the displacement on the MR16DDT that uses forged internals that can be used from stock power all the way up to 600 horsepower. To figure this out and confirm the information mentioned above, we purchased 2 cranks, one from an MR18DE and one from an MR20DD. We have several MR16 DDT cranks here, so we had that covered. We got to measuring. The MR16 and MR18 cranks were identical, the only difference being the location in the crank for the oil passages. The weights were the same size, the cast sections between the bearing surfaces were the same size, it was all the same. It gets interesting when you look at the MR20 crank. The MR20 crank was the same size as the MR1618 cranks, so it would fit. But the rod sections of the crank were significantly further from the center line of the MR1618 cranks. This confirmed our initial suspicion that the MR18 DDT and MR20 gained 0.2 liters from just different crank. It is important to note that the structure and material the MR20 crank is made out of matches the MR16 DDT crank. We have pushed that crank to over 500 horsepower, so the MR20 crank will be capable of the same. All 3 cranks have the same trigger wheel, same nose, and the same flywheel bolt pattern. So we installed an MR20 crank on an MR16 DDT. With the crank installed, we spun it 360 degrees to see if it would impact anything on the engine. Nothing. Cleared it all. So, the big part. We took the stock MR16 DDT rod and piston and mounted it onto the cylinders 1 and 4. To be expected, the piston stuck out quite a bit from the bore when at top dead center. After doing some math to figure out the compression height of the OEM piston, we modified the measurement for the extra stroke, called our machine shop to verify we did everything correct, then called Diamond Racing and ordered up forged pistons with the stock 9.5 to 1 compression ratio, but for the MR20 crank. This will give the engine the same specs as the European MR18 DDT, a 90.1mm stroke, with a 79.7mm bore, increasing the MR16 DDT's displacement to 1.8 liters. Now we can already hear it. All that for only 0.2 liters, what's the point? Well, thank you for asking. That's a 12.5% increase in displacement. That's a lot. If you look at one of the most popular tuning platforms in the world for comparison, the RB26, they offer both a 2.8 stroker kit and a 3.2 liter stroker kit. A 2.8 kit gives you only a 7% increase in displacement, and the 3.2 gives you a 23% increase in displacement. so our increase fits nice and snug in that middle area. These are small engines. If you follow along with our builds, you have seen to get big power, you need a big turbo, which means lots of lag due to the engine size. By increasing the displacement by 12.5%, we will, in theory, be able to spool up a turbo 10 to 12% faster, going from 1.6 to a 1.8. On top of that, the engine will start with more torque, which means more torque overall, which translates to more horsepower. There's a reason 5.3 liter V8s can make 500 horsepower on tiny amounts of boost. Displacement really helps, obviously. Could you, in theory, stroke out the MR16 DDT with MR18 DDT internals imported from Europe? Oh yeah, sure. Go for it. But you're going to be purchasing all OEM parts that are only rated for certain power. Then you're going through the trouble of importing those parts. Then going through the trouble of installing it in your engine, all to end up with the same limitations of power that you already had. Long story short, we'll have 1.8 liter stroker kits available within the next 6 weeks.